Good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and start taking a look at a next set of ideas. So we have talked about several themes throughout the term, but this last section is going to take a look at obstacles. And we're going to look at three different obstacles to creating, that create barriers in relationships. Okay? So a quick review. These three lectures are going to cover similar themes. So we're going to cover some of the main ideas here, and then connect them to everything we've been talking about so far. Okay, so we've looked at two major themes this semester. One being the primacy of relationships in determining who we are. So we've talked a lot about that. It goes all the way back to the I-thou idea, where this relationship here is central to our creating ourselves and who we are, as well as others, creating the other people in our lives. The central part of it is the relationship. The second part, the second major theme we've taken a look at really, is the potential difficulty, as well as the success, of taking a hold of the ability to determine who we are, right? So in that sense, we could think of the I-thou relationship. Others make up who we are. And our context is greatly impacted by what we carry with us. So we've talked about social, political, economic things that we bring with us. And all these things that we've experienced in our lives impact how we relate with other people. And finally, in the last pair of lectures, we looked at power maps and how better understanding the power dynamic in relationships could perhaps help us identify and overcome these obstacles. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail. So this next set of classes, we're going to be taking a closer look at different obstacles or barriers to relationships. So previously, this first part was really identifying broadly what we're taking a look at in marriage and family from a sociological perspective. Broadly what these relationships are. So this is an introduction. And this whole last section is really going to be identifying specifics. So what specific barriers are in U.S. society that can create problems for relationships? So two parts here. We're going to take a look at hierarchies, and we'll define that in a second. We've talked about it before. Hierarchies of value in society, and how these values make one identity more valuable than another. That's the basic idea of what these obstacles have in common. And finally, specifically, we're going to take a look at gender and how it has become a barrier to successful relationships. So gender is the first obstacle we're going to take a look at. And some of this stuff is a review from the text. So if you're reading the textbook, you should know these things, but it'll help cement the ideas we're talking about today. So overall, what is gender? So the two main things we want to distinguish in sociology, as I think we're often popularly more aware of biological facts. So sex is determined by chromosomes. It's a biological feature. And some health issues are also biological. It's something that's genetic. It's predisposed, right? So this might be what we would consider maybe traditional or common understanding of sex, whereas we're more interested maybe on this part in sociology. So this is the sociology part. So what role does sociology play? So for instance, gender itself, there are cultural definitions of what is masculine and feminine. And I imagine if we were to ask about examples of this, masculinity, as we've covered before, might be more associated with work or strength, while femininity is more commonly associated with passivity and docility. Weakness, as we would frame it in U.S. society. So then, associated with that is roles, gender roles. So because we associate men with strength, we might, for example, we'll talk about a military example later. Because we associate men with strength, we might be more accepting of men in the military that requires something that requires strength. while something like teaching or parenting might be something that's more feminine and more emotionally based. So we have a gender a role, a gender identity, and these things are independent. They may be related to, but they're not necessarily connected to biological facts. So in Mead, which you read about in the book, show that culture itself is more important than biology and gender roles. So as we've talked about forms of socialization, so where do these ideas come from? Where do we get ideas of gender? So families, school, peer groups, mass media, all teach gender roles to children and adults. And importantly, from our perspective, these aren't just learned independently, but they're reinforced through interaction. So we learn about gender not only from outside in society, but we're also going to learn about it in between in the actual interaction itself when we're working with other people. Okay? Gender roles versus sex. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about hierarchies then. So if we have gender roles, gender identities in our society, how do those relate with each other when we're considering our big word for the second half of the term, power? Okay, so hierarchies are socially constructed systems assigned to identities in society. Generally, they're binary and one is more valuable than the other. So let's look at a few key terms here. Socially constructed, meaning like gender, it's something that a society makes up. So it's going to vary from society to society and culture to culture. Generally, they're binary, meaning there's two. So we'll go into an example of what that means. So quick one, male, female is generally the binary. We try to fit everything into two identities. It's one or the other. So we've already explored this relationship where we talked about education, where a teacher is more inherently valuable than a student. So hierarchies, when I draw them here and we can think about them, if these were things of, if this was a relation of power in society. Generally then, if we're doing a schooling hierarchy, you would draw the teacher up on top and student on bottom. So we've been talking about this, so we'll use this thing. So the teacher here is more valuable and more powerful, and therefore more powerful than a student who has less value and less power. And not necessarily because of anything inherent, but because of how we constructed it. So when we talked about the classroom before, the teacher's in the front of the class, the student's in the back, the teacher knows things, and the student doesn't. Whereas when we talked about in the equal relationship, in Freire's idea, in the Freire lecture, we talked about breaking down binary. So we're breaking down the binary between teacher and student, so we end up with something like teacher slash student and student slash teacher. And this is just to indicate that a person, depending on what the context is, in some roles, one person might be a teacher, and in other roles, they might be the student. So I think the example we might give, if we're talking about sociology as a group, I would be the teacher in this role, right? But if this was an art class, or we're discussing art, I would definitely be a student. Or even in practical terms, if I had to fix my car, I would definitely be a student in that role because I don't know much about cars, right? So depending on what the context is, this could change. So the thing I want to highlight here is if we're talking about power that we've been matching before, what does this result in? This relationship here, we're going to talk about the relationship. This is non-democratic and unequal. This version here, the hierarchy is non-democratic and unequal. The idea being that if you have this sort of relationship, you're not going to be able to have equality. Inherently, the teacher being more valuable than the student, that can't have an equal relationship, and therefore we can't have a democratic society. Okay, so a similar thing here. We'll label this term here for now, and I'll go into it next, patriarchy. The gender hierarchy in the United States and in other parts of the world is known as a patriarchy. So it's a similar idea, like the teacher-student. Masculine and feminine. In this case, just like in the student-teacher example, the education example, more powerful, masculine is more powerful and more valuable. Right? And the feminine in the United States context and around in other parts of the world, less powerful and less valuable. Right, so the idea being here in a gender hierarchy, similarly to above, can you have a democratic relationship? Can you have equality if one group is inherently more valuable than the other? Whereas we might want to move something more towards a circular relationship where masculine, in this sense, it's a continuum. But rather than one being any more valuable than the other, they're just different parts of the same identity, different parts of the same spectrum. Okay, let's go a little bit more into what that means. So identify this term patriarchy. That's the official term for a gender hierarchy. Okay, so specifically then, the gender hierarchy. So in the United States, we have a patriarchy. There's a clear gender hierarchy known as patriarchy, which is a social system in which men dominate women. And I would also add the system of where masculinity is more valuable than femininity. So, of course, if we think about this then, because as we said, hierarchies are generally binary, meaning there's only two poles, so the masculine and the feminine. So what happens then if you do not fit into one or the other of the categories? If you cannot fit completely into one or the other, hierarchies don't know what to do with that. So what ends up happening then is specifically those, or particularly those, who are not in the binary, all those who do not adhere to the binary, are susceptible even violence or lack of access, so even more obstacles. So specifically, we'll watch a video in a second, members of the LGBTQIA community do not fit in the binary, and thus less social value and access are given to those. So not only are hierarchies problematic for the feminine as being less valuable, if you also don't fit on the binary, it may in some ways present a different or equal problem than if you're feminine. So not fitting into the binary is also itself a problem. Okay, so let's actually check out a video here, and I will post a link below.
Hi, welcome to Feminist Fridays, a series where we explore the social, the political, and the media from the feminist and intersectional perspective, and use a lot of F words. Feminist Fridays, we're going to be discussing the patriarchy, which I think is fitting for Halloween, because it's so scary. What is the dreaded patriarchy? In the simplest terms, patriarchy is a social system that values masculinity over femininity. This type of social system dictates that men are entitled to be in charge and dominate women, and it implies that the natural state of gender relations is a dynamic of dominance and submission. According to patriarchal society, women are seen as weak, submissive, and an extension of men, and the highest accomplishment a woman can hope to attain is marriage, heterosexual, of course, and childbirthing. Fun. On the reverse end of the spectrum, men are expected to be physically and emotionally strong, dominating, and the breadwinner and protector of his family. Although the domination of women today might not be as bad as, say, a couple hundred years ago when women had no legal rights and were considered their husband's property, or even as bad as something you'd see on an episode of Mad Men, gender is still something that is strictly enforced on people today. In patriarchal societies, cisgender men are typically valued over cisgender women. However, this system forces people into strict boxes called gender roles, and gender roles hurt everybody. If someone who is assigned a certain gender at birth doesn't fit into the social norms expected of that gender, they're often ostracized by society. In the past 100 years or so, we've seen a loosening of gender roles for women, but not so much for men. Women can act or dress in a more masculine fashion with less repercussions than if a man were to act or dress in a feminine way. This stems from the valuing of feminine traits over masculine traits and the association of femininity with weakness. femininity. That is the hardest word to say. It's more okay for a woman to act like a man, or whatever that means, than it is for a man to act like a woman. However, the patriarchy doesn't just harm cis women and cis men. It also hurts trans identities and anyone who doesn't identify with the gender binary. Being transgender is almost like the ultimate slap in the face to patriarchy and gender roles, because you're stepping outside of the gender that you were assigned at birth and saying, fuck that. A lot of transphobia that we see is based in sexism and the fact that someone is refusing to stay in the gender box that society put them in. Can we talk about the harmful things that the patriarchy perpetuates? Because there are a lot of them. Women are less likely to hold positions of power. There are only 27 female CEOs in the Fortune 1000, and only 18.5% of Congress is occupied by women. And you might say that more women should run or start their own company, but that's ignoring the reality that women have to face large amounts of discrimination and harassment simply because their gender is seen as less powerful or less credible. And the women that do gain positions of power often have to assert masculine qualities in order to be respected in their position. Women are more likely to be sexually assaulted than men. Women generally do much more of their share of parenting than men do because of gender expectations, often while also working a job. However, men face negative consequences of the patriarchy too. They're expected to be the provider of their family and face the pressure of being financially supportive. The patriarchy perpetuates the idea that women need the protection of men, which is one of the ways in which the patriarchy actually disadvantages men. At many points in time, men have been legally forced by drafts to fight in wars and risk their lives. As for women, they've been actively discouraged by a society that doesn't see them fit for combat from enlisting in the military. And the women that do are harassed, demeaned, and even sexually assaulted simply for having the audacity to think they can do the same jobs as men. Women are also less likely to be seen as criminals and are incarcerated at lower rates than men. This is because women aren't seen as dangerous, and when they are convicted of crimes, the defense claims that they must be mad because they're going against their natural womanly instincts. It's also important to know that patriarchy isn't solely male perpetuated. Just like how everyone is negatively affected by the patriarchy is perpetuated by everybody. Nobody is outside of societal influence, and we've all been socialized to have patriarchal views of gender and how people should be. What's important is that we actively challenge these views instead of just accepting them and work to make society a little bit better. Let me know what you guys thought of this video and leave a comment with a suggestion for what I should talk about.
So I think one of the important things about that Marina points out before we move to the next section is that patriarchy is supported by everyone. For it to exist, it has to be supported by everyone. So that kind of reminds us Foucault's idea that, and also Todd May's idea, that we all play a role within interactions in supporting systems such as patriarchy. So just the idea that it's not because of the importance of interaction we've always been talking about in this class, because of the importance of the interaction here between two people, and how this creates that third space. So there's one individual, a second individual or more, and then the third space that actually is the dynamic part of the relationship. So it's here that things like patriarchy can be preserved, or as Todd May would suggest, this is also where they can be challenged. Okay? So in thinking about this then, I'm sure we've all seen this in some aspects. So in the discussion part of this is, where have we seen patriarchy? And how does patriarchy, most importantly, how does patriarchy affect relationships? So our goal is to take a look at one of these first hierarchies and obstacles that we'll be talking about in the next few lectures. And to see patriarchy and see how it might affect power in a relationship. So the whole thing we talked about, kind of from May's example, or what we've been talking about today, when we're talking about the relationship between two people, how does something, a society that is patriarchal, how is that going to affect the context between two people? So if we start thinking about gender identity, masculinity over femininity, our hierarchy, as one being more important than the other, how does a value system like that going to affect in any relationship that you're in? So if we were to draw one of these power maps and you're to think about how gender might affect you with a loved one, a partner, a spouse, a sibling, a child, etc., how is this sort of patriarchal system going to affect that? Okay, so there's kind of 3 or 4 main points here to think about, and you could pick any or all of these that stick out to you the most. So really, if we're to look around us, where do you see patriarchy in our society? So if we're to think about films, TV, music, or other media examples, social media, that you or your friends or family members or yourself have experienced, where have you seen this? And start thinking about that. Okay? And as a subset of this, recall also that gendered violence or patriarchy doesn't have to be as overt as maybe it once was. It could be more subtle. So we've been thinking about Foucault's idea of panopticon, where we are regulating control in ourselves. So in some ways, we don't necessarily have to act overtly patriarchal in society for patriarchy to continue to operate. So how do you see patriarchy operating this way? How is it in more of a hidden way, like the panopticon idea? And secondly then, can we apply Todd May's tactic to undo patriarchy in our society? So if we're to go back and look at this relationship here, can we break down a relationship like that with Todd May's idea? Really break down all the things that are inside that relationship and start thinking about solutions. Can we come up with solutions with Todd May's example? Solutions, whether personally, how do we interact in a more equal way, or socially, what sorts of things might have to be in place in society for us to be able to interact more equally? So if we analyze the intersections of power between people and consider gender, is there any way to think how we might relate with each other in a more equal way, to rethink it? Okay? So finally then, what sorts of things might need to happen in our society to make gender more equal? Well, I guess the fundamental question then is, do you think we could ever overcome patriarchy in our society? Or is it something that may be such an embedded part of our society that we may not be able to overcome?